Welcome back to Footnotes and Folly and to Josephus. I am Pemberton. This is part 15. Vespasian comes at last before Jotapata, the strong hill town that Josephus himself has fortified and now defends, and here begins one of the most extraordinary sieges in all of ancient history. For 4 to 7 days the Romans raise their banks and bring up their engines, and for 4 to 7 days Josephus answers every device with a cleverer one of his own sudden sallies that fire the siege works, rawhides to deaden the battering ram, boiling oil poured down on the climbing soldiers, and the trick of soaked walls to throw back the storming parties. The Romans batter, the defenders mend, by night, and the dreadful pressure mounts on both sides. Let us continue.
Vespasian marched to the city Gadaea, and took it at the first assault, because he found it without any considerable number of grown men fit for war. When he entered it, he killed all the young men. The Romans showed mercy to no age at all, both because of the hatred they bore the nation, and because of the wrong the Jews had committed in the affair of Cestius. Vespasian also set fire not only to the city itself, but to all the villas and small towns around it. Some of these were completely empty of inhabitants, while from others he carried the inhabitants away as slaves into captivity. As for Josephus, his withdrawal to the city he had chosen as the safest place for himself threw that city into great fear. The people of Tiberias could not imagine that he would have fled unless he had completely despaired of the success of the war. In that judgment they were not mistaken about his opinion. Josephus saw where the affairs of the Jews would finally lead, and understood that they had only one way to escape, which was repentance. Yet although he expected that the Romans would forgive him, he chose to die many times over rather than betray his country, dishonor the supreme command of the army that had been entrusted to him, or live happily under those against whom he had been sent to fight. He therefore decided to send an exact account of affairs by letter to the leading men at Jerusalem. He did not want, by magnifying the enemy's power too much, to make them too afraid, nor did he want, by describing that power is less than the truth, to encourage them to hold out if they were perhaps disposed to repent. He also sent word that if they thought of coming to terms, they must write him an answer at once, but if they resolved on war, they must send him an army sufficient to fight the Romans. Accordingly, he wrote these things and immediately sent messengers to carry his letter to Jerusalem. Vespasian was very eager to demolish Jotapata, for he had received intelligence that the greatest part of the enemy had withdrawn there, and that in other respects it was a place of great security for them. Accordingly, he sent both foot soldiers and horsemen to level the road. The way was mountainous and rocky, difficult for foot soldiers to travel over, and absolutely impassable for horsemen. The workmen completed this task in 4 days and opened a broad road for the army. On the 5th day, the 21st of the month Artemisius or Jar, Josephus moved before Vespasian could act. He came from Tiberias, went into Jotapata, and raised the sinking spirits of the Jews. A certain deserter reported this news to Vespasian, telling him that Josephus had moved there. This made Vespasian hurry toward the city, because he supposed that if he took it, and could at the same time get Josephus into his power, he would in effect take all Judea. He considered this news an enormous advantage, and believed it had been brought about by the providence of God, that the man who seemed the most prudent of all their enemies had, by his own choice, shut himself up in a place of sure confinement. Accordingly he sent Placidus with 1,000 horsemen, and Abutius, a decurion eminent both in counsel and in action, to surround the city so that Josephus could not escape privately. The very next day Vespasian took his whole army and followed them. Marching until late in the evening, he arrived at Jotapata. He brought his army to the north side of the city, and pitched his camp on a certain small hill 7 furlongs from it. He still made every effort to be clearly seen by the enemy, in order to throw them into consternation. This sight was immediately so terrifying to the Jews that none of them dared go outside the wall. Still, the Romans put off the attack at that time because they had marched all day. They did, however, place a double row of battalions around the city, with a third row outside the whole circuit, consisting of cavalry, so that every way of exit was blocked. This made the Jews despair of escape, and that despair stirred them to act more boldly, for nothing makes men fight so desperately in war as necessity. When the Romans made an assault the next day, the Jews at first remained outside the walls and resisted them, meeting them as if they had formed a camp before the city walls. But when Vespasian set the archers, the slingers, and the whole multitude that could throw weapons from a great distance against them, he allowed them to begin their work, while he himself went up with the foot soldiers onto a rising ground from which the city could easily be taken. Josephus then became afraid for the city, leaped out, and the whole Jewish multitude with him. Together they fell upon the Romans in great numbers, drove them away from the wall, and performed many glorious and bold actions. Yet they suffered as much as they caused the enemy to suffer. As despair of deliverance encouraged the Jews, so a sense of shame equally encouraged the Romans. The Romans had skill as well as strength. The Jews had only courage, which armed them and made them fight furiously. The fight lasted all day and ended only when night came on. The Jews wounded many Romans and killed 13 of them. On the Jewish side 17 were killed and 600 wounded. On the next day the Jews made another attack on the Romans. They came out from the walls and fought a much more desperate battle than before. They had now become more courageous because of the unexpectedly strong resistance they had made the day before, and they found that the Romans also fought more desperately. A sense of shame inflamed the Romans into passion, because they considered their failure to gain a sudden victory a kind of defeat. In this way the Romans kept trying to make an impression on the Jews continually until the 5th day, while the people of Jotapata made sallies and fought most desperately at the walls. The Jews were not frightened by the strength of the enemy, and the Romans were not discouraged by the difficulties they met in taking the city. Jotapata itself is built almost entirely on a precipice. On all its other sides there are valleys immensely deep and steep in every direction, so that anyone looking down would have his sight fail before it reached the bottom. It can be approached only on the north side, where the farthest part of the city is built on the mountain as it slopes obliquely into a plain. Josephus had surrounded this mountain with a wall when he fortified the city, so that its summit could not be seized by the enemy. The city is covered all around by other mountains, and cannot be seen at all until a man comes directly upon it. Such was the strong situation of Jotapata. Vespasian therefore resolved to prosecute the siege vigorously, in order to overcome both the natural strength of the place and the bold defense of the Jews. For this purpose he called the commanders under him to a council of war and consulted with them about how the assault might best be carried out. When it was decided to raise a bank against the part of the wall that could be approached, he sent his whole army out to gather materials. They cut down all the trees on the mountains adjoining the city and collected a vast heap of stones besides the wood. Some of them brought hurdles to avoid the darts shot down from above. They spread these hurdles over their banks, and under their cover they built up the bank, suffering little or no harm from the darts thrown from the wall. Others tore down the neighboring hillocks and continually brought earth to the works. Since they were busy in 3 different kinds of labor, nobody was idle. Nevertheless, the Jews threw great stones from the walls onto the hurdles that protected the men, along with all kinds of darts. Even when the missiles did not reach them, the noise was so terrible that it hindered the workmen. Vespasian then placed the engines for throwing stones and darts all around the city. There were 160 engines in all, and he ordered them to begin working and dislodge those on the wall. At the same time, the engines made for that purpose hurled lances at them all at once with a great noise, while other engines threw stones weighing a talent, together with fire and a vast multitude of arrows. This made the wall so dangerous that the Jews not only dared not come onto it, but did not dare approach those places inside the walls that the engines could reach. The multitude of Arabian archers, along with all who threw darts and slung stones, went to work at the same time as the engines. Yet the Jews did not remain idle when they could no longer throw down on the Romans from a higher place. Instead, they made sallies out of the city in parties, like private robbers, pulled away the hurdles that covered the workmen, and killed them when they were exposed. When the workmen gave way, the Jews threw aside the earth that made up the bank and burned its wooden parts along with the hurdles. At length Vespasian realized that the gaps between the works were hurting him, because those spaces gave the Jews room to attack the Romans. So he joined the hurdles together, and at the same time connected one part of the army with another, which stopped the private excursions of the Jews. When the bank had now been raised and brought closer than ever to the battlements of the walls, Josephus thought it would be entirely wrong if he could devise no countermeasure for the preservation of the city. He gathered his workmen and ordered them to build the wall higher. When they said this was impossible while so many darts were being thrown at them, he invented a kind of cover for them. He ordered them to fix piles in place and stretch before them the fresh hides of newly killed oxen. These hides would yield and sag when stones were thrown at them, receiving the blows. Other darts would slide off them, and any fire thrown would be quenched by the moisture in them. He set these hides in front of the workmen, and under them the workmen continued safely by day and by night until they had raised the wall 20 cubits higher. He also built a considerable number of towers upon the wall and fitted it with strong battlements. This greatly discouraged the Romans, who in their own opinion had already gotten within the walls, but were now astonished both at Josephus's contrivance and at the fortitude of the citizens in the city. Vespasian was now plainly irritated by the great subtlety of the stratagem and by the boldness of the citizens of Jotapata. Taking heart again because of the building of this wall, they made fresh sallies against the Romans and fought them every day in separate parties, using all the contrivances that robbers use, plundering whatever came to hand, and setting fire to all the other works. This continued until Vespasian made his army stop fighting them and resolved to lie around the city and starve them into surrender. He supposed that either want of provisions would force them to petition him for mercy, or if they had the courage to hold out to the last, they would perish by famine. He also concluded that he would conquer them more easily in battle if he gave them an interval, and then attack them after they had been weakened by hunger. Still, he gave orders that guards should be kept against their coming out of the city. The besieged had plenty of grain inside the city, and indeed plenty of all other necessities, but they lacked water. There was no fountain in the city, and the people there were usually satisfied with rainwater. Yet rain in that country is rare in summer, and during the season of the siege they were in great distress over how to satisfy their thirst. They were especially sad at this time, as if they were already completely without water. Josephus saw that the city had an abundance of other necessities, that the men were of good courage, and that he wanted to prolong the siege beyond what the Romans expected. So he ordered their drink to be distributed by measure. But this scant distribution of water by measure seemed to them harder to bear than the lack of water itself. Not being able to drink as much as they wished made them desire drink even more than they otherwise would have, and they became as disheartened by it as if they had reached the last extremity of thirst. Nor were the Romans ignorant of their condition. When they stood opposite them beyond the wall, they could see them running together and receiving their water by measure. Since the place was within reach, the Romans threw their javelins there and killed many of them. Because of this, Vespasian hoped that their water containers would soon be emptied, and that they would be forced to surrender the city to him. But Josephus, wishing to break that hope, ordered the people to wet a great many of their clothes and hang them around the battlements until the whole wall suddenly appeared soaked with water running down from it. At this sight the Romans were discouraged and amazed, when they saw the Jews able to throw away and sport so much water which they had supposed the Jews did not even have enough of for drinking. This made the Roman general despair of taking the city through lack of necessities, and he turned again to arms, trying to force them to surrender. That was exactly what the Jews greatly desired. Since they despaired of escaping, either themselves or their city, they preferred death in battle to death by hunger and thirst. Josephus also devised another stratagem, besides the one already mentioned, to obtain plenty of what they lacked. There was a certain rough and uneven place that could scarcely be climbed, and for that reason it was not guarded by soldiers. Josephus sent certain people out along the western parts of the valley, and through them sent letters to whichever Jews outside the city he pleased. By this means he procured an abundance of whatever necessities were needed inside the city. He also ordered those coming in to creep along near the watch as a general rule, and to cover their backs with sheepskins that still had wool on them, so that if anyone spotted them at night they might be taken for dogs. This was done until the watch discovered the scheme, and surrounded the rough place themselves. Josephus now perceived that the city could not hold out long, and that his own life would be in danger if he remained in it. So he consulted about how he and the most powerful men of the city might flee from it. When the multitude learned this, they all gathered around him and begged him not to abandon them, while they depended entirely on him and on him alone. They said there was still hope for the city's deliverance if he would stay with them, because everyone would undertake any labor with great cheerfulness on his account, and in that case they would have some comfort even if they were captured. They said it was not fitting for him either to flee from his enemies, desert his friends, or leap out of that city like a man jumping from a ship sinking in a storm, when he had come into it while it was quiet and calm. By leaving, they said, he would be the cause of the city's sinking, because once he was gone, no one would dare oppose the enemy, since they all trusted wholly in him. Josephus then avoided letting them know that he intended to go away for his own safety. Instead, he told them that he would go out of the city for their sake. If he stayed with them, he said, he would be able to do them little good while they remained in a safe condition, and if they were once captured, he would only perish with them to no purpose. But if he could once get free from the siege, he would be able to bring them very great relief. He would immediately gather the Galileans from the country in great numbers and draw the Romans away from their city by another war. He said he did not see what advantage he could bring them now by staying among them, except to provoke the Romans to besiege them more closely, since they considered it a most valuable thing to capture him. If they were once told that he had fled from the city, they would greatly slacken their eagerness against it. Yet this argument did not move the people, but only made them cling to him more fiercely. Children, old men, and women with their infants came to him weeping, fell down before him, all seized his feet and held him fast, and begged him with great lamentations to share their fortune. I think they did this not because they envied his deliverance, but because they hoped for their own, for they could not believe they would suffer any great misfortune as long as Josephus stayed with them. Now is the time to begin fighting in earnest, when no hope of deliverance is left. It is noble to prefer glory to life, and to undertake some brave action that later generations will remember. Josephus thought that if he decided to stay, it would be attributed to their entreaties, and that if he decided to leave by force, he would be put under guard. His pity for the people under their lamentations had also greatly weakened his eagerness to leave them. So he resolved to stay, and armed himself with the common despair of the citizens. After speaking to them, he immediately went into action. He made a sally, scattered the enemy's outguards, ran as far as the Roman camp itself, tore apart the coverings of their tents that were on their banks, and set fire to their works. In this manner he never stopped fighting, not on the next day nor on the day after that, but continued for a considerable number of days and nights. When Vespasian saw that the Romans were distressed by these sallies, though they were ashamed to be made to run away by the Jews, and when at any time they made the Jews run away, their heavy armor would not let them pursue far, while the Jews, after performing any action, and before they could be hurt, still retired into the city, he ordered his armed men to avoid their onset, and not fight it out with men driven by desperation. Nothing, he said, is more courageous than despair, but their violence would be quenched when they saw that they failed in their purposes, just as fire is quenched when it lacks fuel. It was proper for the Romans to gain their victories as cheaply as they could, since they were not forced to fight, but were only enlarging their own dominions. So he repelled the Jews largely by the Arabian archers, the Syrian slingers, and those who threw stones at them, and there was no pause in the work of the great number of engines used against them. The Jews suffered greatly from these engines without being able to escape them. Yet when the engines threw stones or javelins a great distance and the Jews were within their reach, They pressed hard upon the Romans and fought desperately, sparing neither soul nor body, one group relieving another in turn when it was worn down. When Vespasian considered himself in a manner besieged by these sallies of the Jews, and when his banks were now not far from the walls, he determined to use the battering ram. This battering ram is a vast wooden beam like the mast of a ship. Its front is armed at the head with a thick piece of iron carved in the shape of a ram's head, from which it gets its name. The ram is slung in the air by ropes passing over its middle, hanging like the balance in a pair of scales from another beam, and braced by strong beams running on both sides of it in the form of a cross. When a great number of men pull this ram backward with united force, and then thrust it forward with a mighty noise, it batters the walls with the projecting iron part. There is no tower so strong, nor wall so broad, that can resist more than its first blows forever. All are forced to yield to it at last. This was the device the Roman general turned to when he was eager to take the city, since he found that lying so long in the field was to his disadvantage because the Jews would never let him be quiet. The Romans brought the several engines for harassing the enemy nearer to the walls, so that they could reach those who stood on the wall and frustrate their attempts. These engines threw stones and javelins at them, and likewise the archers and slingers came closer to the wall together. This brought matters to such a state that none of the Jews dared climb onto the walls. Then the other Romans brought up the battering ram, cased all over with hurdles, and secured in its upper part by skins, both to protect the men and to protect the engine. At the very first stroke of this engine the wall was shaken, and a terrible cry rose from the people inside the city, as though they were already taken. When Josephus saw that the ram kept battering the same place, and that the wall would soon be thrown down by it, he resolved to evade the force of the engine for a while. For this purpose he ordered sacks to be filled with chaff and hung down before the place where they saw the ram always striking, so that the blow might be turned aside, or the place might feel less of the strokes because of the yielding nature of the chaff. This contrivance greatly delayed the Romans' efforts. Wherever they moved their engine, those above moved the sacks and placed them opposite its blows, so that the wall suffered no harm because the strokes were diverted. This continued until the Romans devised a countermeasure with long poles, tying hooks to their ends and cutting off the sacks. When the battering ram recovered its force in this way, and the newly built wall began to give way, Josephus and those around him immediately resorted to fire for their defense. They took whatever dry materials they had, made a sally in 3 directions, and set fire to the Roman machines, the hurdles, and the banks themselves. The Romans did not know well how to help them, being both shocked by the boldness of the Jews and prevented by the flames from coming to their aid. Since the materials were dry, with bitumen and pitch among them, and brimstone also, the fire caught everything immediately, and what had cost the Romans great labor was consumed in 1 hour. Here a certain Jew appeared who was worthy of being recorded and praised. He was the son of Samius, was called Eleazar, and was born at Sab in Galilee. This man picked up an enormous stone, and threw it down from the wall upon the ram with such force that it broke off the head of the engine. He also leaped down, took up the head of the ram from among the Romans, and carried it without concern to the top of the wall, while standing as a clear target to be struck by all his enemies. He received the blows on his naked body, and was wounded with 5 darts, yet he paid no attention to any of them while he climbed to the top of the wall. There he stood in sight of all as an example of the greatest boldness. After this, with his wounds upon him, he drew himself together in a heap and fell down along with the head of the ram. Next to him, 2 brothers showed their courage. Their names were Netir and Philip, both from the village Ruma and both Galileans. These men leaped upon the soldiers of the 10th Legion and fell upon the Romans with such noise and force that they threw their ranks into disorder and put to flight all whom they attacked. After these men's actions, Josephus and the rest of the multitude with him took a great quantity of fire and burned both the machines and their coverings, along with the works belonging to the 5th and 10th Legions, which they put to flight. Others immediately followed them and buried those instruments and all their materials underground. However, toward evening the Romans set up the battering ram again against the part of the wall that had suffered before. There a certain Jew who was defending the city from the Romans struck Vespasian in the foot with a dart and wounded him slightly. The distance was so great that the dart thrown from so far away could not make a deep wound. Still, this caused the greatest disorder among the Romans. Those standing near Vespasian saw his blood and were disturbed by it, and a report spread through the whole army that the general had been wounded. Most of the soldiers left the siege and came running together to the general in surprise and fear. Titus came before all the others, out of concern for his father. The multitude fell into great confusion, both because of their regard for their general and because of the distress the son was in. Yet the father soon put an end to the son's fear and to the disorder of the army. Rising above his pain, and trying quickly to be seen by all who had been frightened about him, he stirred them up to fight the Jews more briskly. Now everyone was willing to expose himself to danger immediately in order to avenge their general. They encouraged one another with loud voices and ran hastily to the walls. Still Josephus and those with him did not abandon the wall, though they fell dead one upon another from the darts and stones thrown by the engines. Instead, they attacked those who operated the ram under the protection of the hurdles, using fire, iron weapons, and stones. Yet they could do little or nothing, and they themselves kept falling. They were seen by those whom they could not see, because the light of their own flames shone around them and made them as visible a target to the enemy as if it were daytime, while the engines could not be seen clearly at a great distance, making the missiles hard to avoid. The force with which these engines threw stones and darts struck several men at a time. The violent noise of the stones cast by the engines was so great that they carried away the pinnacles of the wall and broke off the corners of the towers. No body of men could be so strong that it would not be overthrown to the last rank by the size of the stones. Anyone may understand the force of the engines from what happened that very night. One of the men standing near Josephus by the wall had his head carried away by such a stone, and his skull was flung as far as 3 furlongs. In the daytime also, a pregnant woman who had just come out of her house was struck so violently in the belly that the infant was carried half a furlong away, so great was the force of that engine. The noise of the instruments themselves was very terrible, as was the sound of the darts and stones thrown by them. The noise made by the dead bodies when they were dashed against the wall was of the same kind. Dreadful too was the outcry these things raised among the women inside the city, which was echoed at the same time by the cries of those being killed. The whole ground on which they fought ran with blood, and the wall could have been climbed over by stepping on the bodies of the dead. The mountains also increased the noise with their echoes. Nothing was lacking that night which could terrify either the hearing or the sight. Yet a great part of those who fought so hard for Jotapata fell bravely, and a great part of them were wounded. The morning watch had arrived before the wall yielded to the machines used against it, although it had been battered without pause. Even then, those inside covered their bodies with their armor and raised works opposite the part that had been thrown down, before the machines were set by which the Romans were to climb into the city. In the morning Vespasian gathered his army in order to take the city by storm, after giving them a little rest from the hard labor they had endured the night before. Since he wanted to draw away those who opposed him from the places where the wall had been thrown down, he ordered the bravest of the horsemen to dismount and place them in 3 ranks opposite the ruins of the wall. They were covered with armor on every side and held poles in their hands, so that they could begin their ascent as soon as the instruments for climbing were laid. Behind them he placed the flower of the foot soldiers. As for the rest of the cavalry, he ordered them to spread out opposite the wall over the whole hilly country, so that no one could escape from the city when it was taken. Behind these he placed the archers all around, and commanded them to have their arrows ready to shoot. He gave the same command to the slingers and to those who managed the engines. He also ordered others to take up ladders, and have them ready to set against the parts of the wall that were still untouched, so that the besieged would be occupied trying to prevent those ascents, and would leave the ruined parts less guarded, while the rest would be overwhelmed by the darts cast at them, and would give his men an entrance into the city. Josephus understood the purpose of Vespasian's plan. He placed the old men, together with those worn out by fatigue, at the sound parts of the wall, since he expected no harm from those quarters. He stationed his strongest men at the place where the wall was broken down, and before them all he set 6 men by themselves, among whom he took his own share of the first and greatest danger. He also gave orders that when the legions shouted, they should stop their ears so they would not be frightened by it. To avoid the multitude of the enemy's darts, they were to bend down on their knees, cover themselves with their shields, and retreat a little backward for a while until the archers had emptied their quivers. But when the Romans laid their instruments for climbing the walls, they were to leap out suddenly and meet the enemy with their own instruments. Each man was to strive to do his best, not as if he were defending his own city with any possibility that it could be preserved, but in order to avenge it when it was already destroyed. They were to set before their eyes how their old men would be slain, how their children and wives would immediately be killed by the enemy, and then spend beforehand all their fury over the calamities about to come upon them, pouring it out on those who would cause them. In this way Josephus arranged both groups of his men. But the useless part of the citizens, the women and children, saw their city surrounded by a 3-fold army, since none of the usual guards who had been fighting before were removed. They saw not only the walls thrown down, but also their enemies with swords in their hands, the hilly country above them shining with weapons, and darts in the hands of the Arabian archers. Then they raised a final and lamentable cry over the destruction, as if the misery were not merely threatened, but had already come upon them. Josephus ordered the women to be shut up in their houses, so that by making the men pity their condition, they would not soften their warlike actions. He commanded them to keep silent and threatened them if they did not. Then he himself came before the breach where his assignment was. He took no notice of all those who brought ladders to the other places, but waited intently for the shower of arrows that was coming. Now the trumpeters of the several Roman legions sounded together, and the army gave a terrible shout. The darts, as if by command, flew so thickly that they blocked the light. Yet Josephus's men remembered the instructions he had given them. They stopped their ears against the sounds and covered their bodies against the darts. As for the engines that were ready to be put to work, the Jews ran out upon them before those who were to use them had gotten onto them. When the soldiers began ascending, there was a great conflict, with many actions of both hand and spirit. The Jews earnestly tried, in their extreme danger, not to show less courage than those who were fighting so stoutly against them without being in danger. They did not stop struggling with the Romans until they either fell dead themselves or killed their opponents. The Jews grew weary from defending themselves continually, and did not have enough men to come in their place and relieve them. On the Roman side, fresh men kept replacing those who were tired. New men quickly got onto the climbing machines in place of those who had been thrust down. Encouraging one another and joining shield to shield for protection, they became a body of men that could not be broken. As this band pushed the Jews away, as though it were one single body, they began already to get up onto the wall. Then Josephus took necessity as his counselor in this utmost distress, for necessity is very sharp in invention when it is stirred by despair. He ordered scalding oil to be poured on those who were protected by their shields. Many men soon got it ready, bringing a great quantity, and they poured it from all sides upon the Romans. They also threw down the vessels themselves while they were still hissing from the heat of the fire. The oil burned the Romans so badly that it scattered the united band, and they tumbled down from the wall in horrible pain. The oil easily ran down the whole body from head to foot under their full armor, and fed upon their flesh like flame itself. Its fatty and oily nature made it heat quickly and cool slowly. Since the men were confined inside their helmets and breastplates, they had no way to free themselves from the burning oil. They could only leap and roll about in pain as they fell down from the bridges they had laid. As they were beaten back and retreated toward their own side, while their own men still pressed them forward, they were easily wounded by those behind them.
And we will halt there, with Jotapata still holding against everything Rome can throw at it, but starving, exhausted, and very nearly spent. Next time, in part 16, the town falls at last and Josephus is driven into a cave with 40 companions, where a suicide pact and a drawing of lots leave him, almost alone, to walk out and face Vespasian. Mind the footnotes, and beware the folly.